All right, good evening. Welcome to UPARS LA. My name is Steve Murillo. I'm the director for this organization. This is August 2016. And we have a very special guest tonight. His name is Nick Redfern, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Nick, and probably many of you have read his books. In fact, he has several of them available tonight. Nick has written, he's an author, he's a prodigious author. He's written over 40 books on UFOs and the paranormal, 40. So he is what you call a disciplined person. He's committed to the trade. He writes on a daily basis. I'm sure he gets up in the morning and has a schedule, and he writes, and then he writes, and then he goes to the gym, or he goes and does his thing, right? But every day he's doing that. So he is an accomplished author because of that discipline, and a lot of respect goes out to Nick for what he's done. His favorite topics are Bigfoot, UFOs, all kinds of strange things out there, the paranormal. And tonight, he's going to be talking about something I've never heard anyone else talk about before. He's going to be talking about the women in black. All of you have heard of the men in black. We've all seen the movies. And the men in black is a very strange phenomenon. Many people have experienced the men in black. It's a true phenomenon. It's not just something that Hollywood made up. They made up that movie based on reality. But tonight, he's going to describe something I've never really even conceived, and it's the women in black. So often is the case. Let me see if I can read a little excerpt from the back of this book. All right. Everyone has heard of the men in black, but what about the women in black? Just like their cohorts and counterparts, the women in black will stop at nothing to silence those who get too close to the truth behind the UFO phenomenon. So I'm not going to go any further. I've wasted your time enough. Just let's bring up Nick Redfern.
Thanks, everybody. I'm the one with the funny accent, by the way. As Steve just said, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is the Men in Black mystery, but also focus on, as Steve also said, the lesser-known subject of women in black. And it's one aspect of the subject that's sort of very much gone under the radar for years. A lot of people don't know anything about it at all. And it's kind of surprising that sort of 70 years after the whole UFO subject kicked off, to find something pretty much completely new, and that apart from a few cases over the years, nobody's paid a great deal of attention to. Now, as far as, I guess, the general public's perceptions on the Men in Black are concerned, everything kind of revolves around the movies. You know, everybody, whether they're interested in... Oh, okay. I mean, everybody outside of ufology who has heard of the Men in Black knows of that term because they've watched the movies, the Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones films. And although the films are entertaining and fun, they're actually quite far removed from the reality of the Men in Black situation. For example, in the movies, the MIB work for a government agency, or possibly an agency that's buried so deep within the government that even the government itself doesn't know about it. But however way you look at it, the Men in Black are presented as sort of ufological 007s or something along those lines. But the reality of the Men in Black is way different from the movie versions. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. The reality of the case is that many of the Men in Black reports suggest that they're not even human, as bizarre as that might sound, even though as I said, the movie counterparts do sort of portray that approach. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the classic cases, how the subject began, and the different theories that exist for what the MIB might actually be. So what I'm going to do is sort of talk for about an hour and 10, something like that, and then we can sort of get into questions and answers. If anybody's got any questions, it doesn't have to be on the Men in Black, it could be on any subject, you know, we can talk about whatever. So we're going to get started. If we could have the first image, please. That's one of 3 books I've written on the Men in Black. That's the most recent one. And what I've found in writing books on the Men in Black is that it's like anybody writes a book on a particular subject. If people read it and they can relate to it because they've had an experience, they contact you. And that's what's happened to me over the course of writing the 3 Men in Black books, that I've probably received somewhere in the region of at least 300 or 400 reports, probably somewhere in the region of 30 to 40% of them from the last decade. And that's sort of important because a lot of people assume that the Men in Black mystery is actually an old one, sort of from the 40s, 50s and 60s that then died out. But it's actually not. These reports are still going on to this day. And I think that's an important thing to note, because again, otherwise, had these reports not reached me, even I would have thought, it's something that sort of reached its peak decades ago and then has just vanished into nothing. Very, very different to the truth, however. And the next one. Now, I mentioned that the Men in Black mystery is an old one. That's the very first book ever published on the Men in Black, titled They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, written by a guy named Gray Barker. And Barker's book tells the story of a man named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender was the one person more than any other who sort of gave birth, if you like, to the Men in Black mystery. And it all revolved around a series of incidents that happened in his hometown, which was Bridgeport, Connecticut. And Bender was he was an interesting but also unusual guy. As I said, he lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and the house he lived in, if any of you have seen the movie Psycho and Norman Bates' mother's house, sort of creepy old house on the hill, that's where Albert Bender lived. And of all rooms possible, he rented the attic, and because he liked attic rooms for some reason. And what he did, he sort of modified this so-called attic bedroom, into what he called a chamber of horrors. And he was very much interested and involved in the occult, not just UFOs, but supernatural, paranormal, the occult, in fiction and fact. He was a big fan of the fictional novels of people like Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker and H.P. Lovecraft, people like that. So he was very much primed when the whole UFO subject kicked off in the summer of 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting of a squadron of UFOs over Washington state. And like a lot of people who were interested in UFOs at the time, Albert Bender decided to establish a UFO research group, and it was called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He created it in 1951, and the IFSB actually took off on a massive scale to the point where he had followers all across the planet, not just in the United States. And he found himself copying the newsletter, not by the dozens, but by the hundreds. And he had networks in Australia, Canada, the UK, Australia, South America, all essentially subscribing to his magazine and sharing information. So in other words, in a very short period of time, Albert Bender became a major force in ufology. And that was made all the more intriguing and mysterious by the fact that in 1953 he suddenly closed the IFSB down. And nobody really knew why he'd done it. At first they thought it was, most people in ufology thought it was a kind of a publicity stunt. Probably the best analogy I can think of is if you think of your favourite band and they all go on tour and they say, this is going to be our retirement tour, our farewell tour, and so everybody buys the tickets and goes to see them, and then they come back 3 years later and people feel cheated. That's what people thought was happening with Albert Bender, that it was some kind of publicity stunt, but it actually wasn't. He left ufology behind and vowed never to come back to it, although he did make a very brief return in '62, as I'll point out. Now, Gray Barker's book, as you can see on the front cover, it's got 3 shadowy men in black. That's really the first piece of artwork that was ever done to sort of demonstrate who or what the Men in Black are. So in other words, if we look at the movies from the 1990s, what we actually find is that reports of the Men in Black go way back to the 50s, and even the image of them in the dark suits. And the reason why there are 3 on the screen is because for some weird reason, most times the Men in Black turn up in groups of 3. Occasionally it's 2. I'm not aware of any cases where it's 4 or more, but usually it's 3. And Gray Barker presented Albert Bender's story in what was actually a very distorted way, although that wasn't necessarily Barker's fault, because Bender didn't want to relate too many of the facts to him because it was so bizarre. So Barker concluded that the men in black that silenced Albert Bender must have been from the government, some sort of intelligence agency, and that's how he wrote his book. But the reality was very, very different. We can have the next one. I mentioned that Albert Bender very, very briefly came back to the UFO subject in 1962, and he wrote his own book, Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which Gray Barker, who wrote the previous one, also published. Now, in Flying Saucers and the Three Men, Albert Bender's own book, the MIB are very, very different to the government angle that's presented in Barker's book. In Bender's story, they come across almost as sort of a cross between, I guess, government agents and zombies is the best way I can describe them. I'm not exaggerating, that's how they come across. What Bender said was that in 1951, as I said, he got involved in the UFO subject, but he was also very involved in the paranormal. And he created in this chamber of horrors, as he called it, this attic room that he lived in, he created this altar, he called it a supernatural altar, which he tried to use to sort of call forward supernatural entities from other realms and dimensions of existence. So, you know, I told you it gets into some really strange areas that go beyond, far beyond the movie angles. And Albert Bender was someone who wasn't sort of just a dabbler in the world of the occult. He's very learned and knowledgeable in that particular field. And with hindsight, he felt that by digging into the world of the supernatural, by creating this so-called supernatural altar and invoking something to come through, he felt with hindsight that he'd actually opened sort of a portal or a doorway that led these men in black through from some other realm of existence. And according to Albert Bender, the three men in black didn't sort of knock on the front door as most people would assume was the case. What he said was that he was in his attic room one night and he started to feel ill. He started to feel sick and lightheaded and cold and clammy, and he had to lay down. And he said as he did that, the room was filled with this overwhelming odour of sulphur. And sulphur crops up in a lot of paranormal tales. And he lay down on the bed, as I said, he was feeling really lightheaded, as if he was going to pass out. And suddenly he saw these three shadowy figures start to sort of materialise in the bedroom. And if any of you are aware of the shadow people phenomenon, that's actually what they kind of looked like. They were sort of a silhouette of a person wearing a fedora hat, but they had no sort of substance to them. They were just sort of smoky and foggy. And then over time, they did take on like a physical form, but they didn't look like most of us do. He said they were extremely pale, only about 5 feet tall, and they had these large shining eyes, but they looked sort of vaguely human. And reportedly, they spoke to him in a telepathic fashion and essentially warned him to leave the UFO subject behind, and then they added for good measure or else. And Bender actually sort of didn't heed the warning to start with, and he found himself being followed by them late at night. If he was a big fan of sci-fi movies and horror movies. He said he would go to the cinema late at night and he would see these shadowy figures following him along the road or in the alleyways, just watching him, sort of taunting him. And Albert Bender suffered extremely badly from his exposure to these men in black. He developed, for what reason we don't know, he developed a deep fear of getting cancer. He also developed a very severe case of obsessive compulsive disorder and stomach ulcers, and he felt it was all due to the presence of these men in black. He almost felt as if they'd sort of supernaturally infected him somehow. That's literally the way he kind of worded it. Being in their presence had somehow made him sick. And he felt as time went on there was only one way for him to sort of break the spell, and that was to walk away from the UFO subject, which is exactly what he did. As I said, he only came back in 1962 to write that book, and he did a very short book tour around the East Coast, and then he walked away from the subject forever, never came back to it. So in other words, it wasn't a publicity stunt. He was terrified out of his mind and was just fearful of ever going back into the UFO subject. Now, Albert Bender actually only died about 4 months ago at the age of 94. So it demonstrates that, you know, even if you are going to get threatened by the men in black, doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to make it to almost 100, which he actually did. So in that sense, there is kind of a positive angle to it in a weird way. But I guess Bender's case is important for several reasons. It was the first primary important case. Number two, it demonstrates that what Bender saw and what most people see is far removed from the so-called secret agent angle, and it demonstrates sort of the threat angle that we see in so many of these cases begin to develop, and also the way in which the Men in Black are extremely good at sort of psychologically destabilizing people. There's barely a case on record where people haven't felt extremely stressed, terrified, and even paranoid because of the exposure to the Men in Black. Now, if you have the next one, please. That looks like a Man in Black, and technically it is, but that's actually Brad Steiger, who's a famous writer of books on UFOs and all sorts of different paranormal topics. I call that one the second wave because when Albert Bender's encounter occurred in the early 50s, there was a spate of activity that went through about 1956, and then the subject kind of died off a little bit, but it came back in force in the 1960s, hence the term the second wave. And Brad Steiger was someone who got into the UFO subject pretty much as soon as it began, and Brad began writing books in the mid-1960s, and as I said, on all sorts of subjects. And one of the areas that really intrigued Brad was the Men in Black, and still does intrigue him to this day. He's just had a brand new book out just recently, which is a really good study of a wide range of paranormal entities called Real Visitors. And Brad experienced something that a lot of people in the UFO subject find, namely that when they start investigating the Men in Black mystery, it's almost as if the Men in Black have some sort of paranormal radar where they know when people are looking for them. The term was probably best coined in the movie version. If any of you have seen the movie version of John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, there's a character in the movie based on Keel named Alexander Leake, and he says to one of the other characters that when you notice these things, they notice that you notice them. In other words, we go looking for this stuff like the Men in Black, then somehow the Men in Black are aware that we're looking for them, so then they turn the tables on us. And that actually happened to Brad. I did a very extensive interview with Brad about 5 or 6 years ago, all about his MIB experiences, and probably the most creepy one he told me concerned a friend of his who in the mid-60s went on vacation to Europe for about a week or so and spent a couple of days in London while he was there. And he was looking at Buckingham Palace, Trafalgar Square, all the sort of classic London landmarks, and he noticed that these three small, thin, skinny, pale Men in Black were following him around London. And because they stood out so much, they had the old style fedora hats, they looked really pale, almost like anemic looking, and were watching him. Now, Brad's friend had spent enough time with Brad to know that this looked like the Men in Black. And so he phoned Brad up and said, "You're not going to believe this, but," and then told him exactly what was going on. And Brad was like, "Well, just keep me posted, keep me informed of what's going on." It turns out that the following night, in the early hours, around about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, the guy felt impelled to go to the window of his hotel room, and he looked down, and sure enough, there were the three Men in Black staring up from the lamppost outside the window. And that freaked him out even more. Then the following day, they actually approached him, and one of them said, "You're a friend of Brad Steiger," and it was more of a statement than a question. And he said, "Well, yes." And one of them said, "Tell him we will meet him at Christmas time," which kind of sounds a little bit ominous. What's going to happen at Christmas? But fortunately, Brad's not the sort of person who that would be intimidated by that, and he basically said, "Well, bring it on." And certainly nothing actually did happen at Christmas time. But again, that's something that the Men in Black often do. They make these sort of veiled threats where the person thinks, "Wow, was my life just threatened?" But they do it in a way that is so sort of couched in mystery. So Brad is a perfect example of someone who found himself investigating the Men in Black then to have the tables turned on him to where the Men in Black began to sort of manipulate and plague his life. And Brad also experienced something, again, that a lot of researchers and witnesses get. That is, after the initial visit from the Men in Black, people get weird phone calls in the middle of the night, very often sort of 2 or 3 a.m. You know, for any of us, if you wake up in the middle of the night and the phone's ringing, your first thought is it's bad news, you know, because who else phones you at 4 in the morning or whatever. So most people answer the phone. And typically, for the people who've been visited by the Men in Black, they often hear sort of weird electronic noises on the line, or what sounds like a foreign language, but one that they can't understand, but being spoken extremely quickly. And again, I think this may be done to sort of destabilise the person by making these calls night after night, you know, disturbing their sleep patterns, getting them frazzled and fried. Again, something the Men in Black are very good at doing. And Brad experienced a lot of this, where there was a lot of telephone interference. Even people phoning UFO witnesses claiming to be Brad, as if they were trying to get information out of them, but pretending to be him, you know, who they trusted. And then Brad would have to say, well, sorry, it wasn't me. And that crops up a lot in Men in Black cases as well, where people find that somebody is impersonating them, pretending to be them. And again, I think it's done to get information out of people, but also I think it's done to worry the person, to stress them out. And unfortunately, it works pretty much every time. And the next one, please. Now, people often ask me, is there any proof, any physical proof for the existence of the Men in Black? Well, I always tell people that the most important people in the UFO subject are the witnesses, because without the witnesses, we don't actually have anything to go on. So, you know, when they share their stories with us, that allows us to do an investigation. So, you know, that's why we sort of need to treat the witnesses with respect, because they're the ones who are giving an insight into what's going on. So there's no doubt we have probably somewhere now in the region of about 3,000 Men in Black reports going back to the 40s. And of course there's who knows how many reports where the witnesses didn't want to speak out. You know, they were too frightened or embarrassed or worried that the Men in Black might come back if they decided to speak again. And so, you know, as well as the 3,000 or so that we've got, you know, we could theorise there could be double that amount or even more. But we do have some physical evidence, and that's in the terms of photographs. Now, there are a few modern day images on the internet which particularly you can find on YouTube, which are kind of controversial, but you know, they're still interesting. But there's one which has sort of very much stood the test of time since the 1960s, and it involves this guy, a man named Timothy Green Beckley. Tim's written actually many books over the years on everything from Bigfoot to the lake monsters to UFOs to Men in Black. He's done a couple of books on the Men in Black. And Tim got interested in the UFO subject as a teenager. I think he's about 70 now, and he's still very active on the scene. But in the mid-1960s, Tim, just like Brad Steiger, began to get involved in the Men in Black mystery. That was one of his big areas of interest and still is. And if we can go to the next one. Now, he had a friend, that's a guy named Jim Mosley. Jim died just a couple of years ago. But the story revolves around both of them. At the time, they were both living in New York. And one morning, Tim got a phone call from a woman named Mary Robertson. And Mary was married to a guy named Jack Robertson, and they lived in Jersey City. And they were sort of the go-to people for ufology in Jersey City in the 60s. And what happened was that Mary said, effectively, you're not going to believe this, but the last 2 days running, there's been a man in black hovering across the road, staring into the window of our kitchen, just kind of with this menacing zombie-like look on his face. And what was interesting about this case is that, for the most part, if people get a visit from the Men in Black, they only get one visit. As I said, there are these follow-up things like phone calls and weird static on the line and things like that. But most people don't get a second physical visit, it's just once. But this Man in Black supposedly had been there for 2 days. Then the third day, Mary phoned again and said to Tim, he's there again. And so Tim phoned Jim Moseley and said, Jim, look, you know, we need to get over there and see if he's going to be there on the 4th day. And sure enough, they drove over to Jersey City from New York. Jim stopped by, picked Tim up, they headed out, and Tim had got a camera handy. And sure enough, as they got to the area where across the road you had Mary and Jack's house, and in the other side of the road you had the recess where this man in black was stood, sure enough he was there. So Tim leaned out of the car and took a photo. If we can get the next one up, please. Now, you might not see that unless you're right close to the front, but I've got a blow-up of it, which I'll show in a bit. You can see the front of a car there, and there's a guy there stood in the doorway, and he's got like a black fedora on, long black coat, black gloves, and in the blow-up, as you'll see, he's wearing sunglasses, but they don't look like regular sunglasses. They kind of almost look like a ski mask almost. As you can see, they sort of really cover his eyes. You can see there he's got black gloves, and it almost looks like, if you look at the old Western movies, you know, where the bandits used to wear a mask around their eyes, that's almost looks like what he's wearing. And he does just seem to be vacantly staring across the road. And that's what Mary said he was doing for 4 days running. And the weirdest thing of all was that she said that whenever she would look away, even for a second, he would be gone. It was almost as if he was waiting for her to disappear. For her to sort of look away, and then he would disappear. And again, sort of demonstrating a very strange aspect of this mystery. But nobody ever got to the bottom of this particular mystery, because Tim and Jim swung the car around the corner quickly, jumped out, raced back, and he was gone. And after this particular day, he never surfaced again. But everything about him is kind of strange. The doorway is just a recess. There's actually nothing there other than an old abandoned building at the time. And the very fact that he was staring into the kitchen window of a UFO researcher, of course, is important too. People say to me, could it just be a guy who happens to be dressed in black rather than a man in black? Well, it could be, but as I said, there's the UFO component with the researchers living directly opposite where he was, and the fact that he dressed so strange and he had these large, weird glasses on. And bear in mind, this was during the summer as well, and he was wearing these thick black gloves. So everything about the case was kind of strange. And we've got probably somewhere in the region of 5 or 6 similar photographs to this one, suggesting that, yes, people have been lucky enough to catch the men in black on film. But as I'll talk about later, there are some cases where people have tried to photograph them for the cameras not to pick anything up on the camera, even though the person was aiming the camera direct at the MIB, but nothing appeared on the screen at all. And the next one, please. Now, the guy on the right is John Keel, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote the book The Mothman Prophecies. And on the left is a friend of mine, Greg Bishop, who Greg lives in LA, and he's done a lot of research also into the Men in Black. And John Keel got involved in the Men in Black mystery in 1966 when the whole Mothman phenomenon began in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Now, for those of you who may not have heard of Mothman, it was this strange sort of flying humanoid creature that was seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia from the middle part of 1966 through the end of 1967. And as I said earlier, it was made into a hit movie in 2002 called The Mothman Prophecies. And the story is a very weird one. People in and around Point Pleasant in 66 began to report seeing this sort of 7 to 8 foot tall creature with glowing red eyes and these large wings that kind of gave it like an image somewhere between like a giant bird and a gargoyle or something like that. And it sort of terrified all the people who saw it. But on top of that, people began to have UFO encounters, and then the Men in Black turned up and started pestering and threatening people who'd seen Mothman. They would particularly target people that had Mothman encounter. They would knock on the door late at night and essentially threaten their lives to a degree. So John Keel, as a writer, thought this was a great story and headed out to Point Pleasant and spent actually several months out there altogether chronicling all the things that were going on, and then turned it into his his book, Mothman Prophecies. And the next one. That's sort of an artist's rendition of Mothman. As you can see, standing on a huge bridge. Now, the bridge itself was a real bridge. It was called the Silver Bridge, and it spanned the Ohio River. On one side, you had West Virginia, where Point Pleasant was. Then you got the river, the Ohio River, and Ohio on the other side. And what happened was that in December 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed while there were dozens of cars on the bridge, and somewhere in the region of about 40 people drowned when their cars just plunged into the river and they couldn't get out. And a lot of researchers, like Keel himself, felt that the tragedy and all the deaths and the collapse of the bridge were linked to the presence of Mothman, as if some sort of supernatural omen had sort of was hanging over the town itself. And a lot of researchers still believe that today, although the belief system has kind of changed, where more researchers today think Mothman was more of a warning entity rather than something that actually caused the disasters itself. But Keel found again that when we were dealing with things like Mothman, that the Men in Black would turn up. And this sort of demonstrates another aspect to the mystery, namely that the Men in Black don't just threaten people who've seen UFOs, they also threaten people who've seen strange creatures like Mothman. And again, that's sort of far and away and removed from the movie versions. And still on the subject of strange creatures, if we can have the next one. Now that's an artist's rendition of an animal called a plesiosaur. Plesiosaur was a marine reptile that allegedly became, or supposedly became, extinct around about 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs died out. A number of researchers think that the so-called Loch Ness monsters might be surviving pockets of plesiosaurs. Other people think they might be giant eels. Other people think they could be just some sort of animal that science still hasn't recognised or classified. But the interesting thing about Loch Ness is it has a lot of weird paranormal aspects to it, including a Men in Black connection. Now, Loch Ness is sort of a spooky, creepy place at the best of times. It's about 22 miles long, about a mile wide, and about 700 feet deep. It's very foggy, water's very dark, and there are several ruined castles all around it. So it kind of looks like somebody's just stepped out of a page of a Harry Potter novel or something like that. And of course, at the heart of it all, you've got the Loch Ness monsters. And you might wonder, well, why on earth would the Men in Black have a connection to the to the Loch Ness monster? Well, as for why, we're still struggling for an answer. But there have been a number of MIB encounters at Loch Ness. Probably the most famous one involved a man named Ted Holliday. Ted Holliday was someone who got involved and interested in the Loch Ness mystery in the 1950s. And from the 60s onwards, what he would do every year, he would take 2 weeks off from his job, the same 2 weeks every year, and have his vacation at Loch Ness. And he would go and camp on the shore for days, nights, with his camera ready. And to begin with, Ted Holliday was a full-on believer that whatever the creatures of Loch Ness were, that they were flesh and blood animals that could be eventually caught or killed. But he found something strange as he went along, as a number of researchers have. On several occasions he thought he saw one of these creatures surface from the water, so he tried to photograph it, only for his camera to jam at the crucial point. On other occasions the pictures were taken, but they came out fogged or completely blank. And that actually occurred to a number of people at Loch Ness trying to photograph these creatures, as if some sort of supernatural force was preventing them from actually taking the pictures. Now, in the summer of 1974, this was about the 13th year that Ted Holliday did nothing but go to Loch Ness every vacation. One particular morning, he had that sort of feeling we all get from time to time. You're in the checkout line at the local store and you think somebody's watching you, and you turn around and somebody is watching you. We've all had that feeling. We don't really know how we know it, but you know when you're kind of being watched. And Ted Holliday had this feeling, and so he sort of whipped around. Bear in mind, it was a very isolated part of the loch, and there was sort of a classic Man in Black just staring at him, sort of
with this malevolent, evil look on his face. And suddenly there was like a brush of wind went straight by Ted Holliday's face, and he turned, and as he turned back, the man in black had gone. It was just kind of like the situation with Jack and Mary Robertson in Jersey City a decade earlier. Now, the story gets more ominous because exactly 1 year later, when Ted Holliday was back at the very same place where he saw the man in black, he had an extremely serious heart attack. And as the ambulance crew stretched him away, he realised that they literally carried him over the area, or the exact spot where the man in black had been seen the previous year. And he felt that this was sort of some sort of deadly warning, you know, get out of this subject or else. And Ted Holliday didn't heed the warning. He actually did die young. He died at 59 in 1979 from a heart attack. And more than a few researchers have come around to the idea since then that the Loch Ness monsters are some sort of paranormal manifestation rather than surviving pockets of something like plesiosaurs. So again, this shows that how the Men in Black mystery goes far beyond, again, just UFOs, just aliens, when we start seeing things like Mothman and the Loch Ness monsters in it as well. And the next, please. And to bring things sort of more up to date, that's a good friend of mine named Marie Jones. Marie's written a lot of really good books on various aspects of the paranormal, UFOs, synchronicities, the 11/11 phenomenon, if any of you have heard of that one, time travel, you name it, Marie's written about it. And she's still writing on the subject today. But in the mid-1990s, Marie and a friend of hers, she lives in San Diego, they set up sort of an alien abduction support group. It wasn't so much designed to investigate abductions, but because a lot of people who'd had abduction type encounters were traumatized, the idea was that they would set up a support group where people could speak to people who'd also undergone these events and share information, and you know, hopefully it would help everybody and create sort of a positive vibe. In no time after they set the group up, both Marie and her friend began to experience a lot of MIB related encounters and tactics. For example, Marie's friend lived in a very isolated wooded area, and she started to see these men in black on the fringes of the property, sort of looming around in the trees, and she could see the black suit and the fedora. And again, it clearly seemed to be the case that they wanted to be seen, and the reason they wanted to be seen was to intimidate the witnesses. And at the same time, Marie began to get the classic telephone calls. Probably the most ominous one of all, she was woken up in the early hours, like 2 a.m, to hear this sort of metallic voice at the other end telling her the title of the book that was on her bedside table that she'd been reading just a few hours earlier. And that was sort of the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, as they say, and both of them decided enough was enough, and they left the UFO subject behind, never to go back to it in terms of this abduction group. But as I said, to Marie's credit, you know, she essentially said, okay, we're going to close the group down, but this isn't going to stop me doing the research. And as I said, she has written a lot of books since then. I think she's probably working on 2 or 3 right now, as she generally is. But again, it shows that from the 1940s and 50s with Albert Bender, right through the 90s and the present day, it shows not much really has changed at all in terms of the tactics and the appearance of the Men in Black. And unfortunately, from our perspectives, their successful nature in terms of silencing people. And the next one, please. Now, of course, the most important question of all is, who are the Men in Black, or possibly what are the Men in Black? They're questions that have sort of provoked a lot of different theories in terms of who or what they might be, and they sort of vary widely and wildly as well. Now, as we said at the beginning, everybody knows the movie versions of the Men in Black. As I said, they work for a secret government agency, and their sort of primary activity is silencing people who've seen UFOs or have had alien encounters. Now, ironically, given the success of the movies, there's very, very little evidence to suggest that the Men in Black are from the government. You know, unless the government is employing sort of hundreds of 5-foot tall anemic little men, which I don't believe they are, you know, that's the only way you could explain that they could come from the government. So we have to look elsewhere. But what's interesting is that through the Freedom of Information Act, both the FBI and the Air Force have declassified files from the 1960s when a large number of US citizens were contacting the FBI and saying, hey, somebody has visited me and threatened me, all because I've seen a UFO, and they claim to be from the Air Force or they claim to be from the FBI. And the Air Force and the FBI looked into these cases and found out that whoever these men in black were, they were masquerading as the FBI and the Air Force. It wasn't the agencies at all. And so both the Air Force and the FBI launched quite extensive investigations to try and effectively catch a man in black, and they sent memos out throughout all their offices, and those memos have now been declassified. So, you know, it's kind of ironic that people in ufology often say the men in black are from the government, and now we have these documents which have been declassified where the FBI and the Air Force were basically saying, who on earth are the men in black? So, in other words, the people who many people might assume or think are the men in black are actually so far removed that it's something else entirely. So I think we can disregard the men in black for the most part, but where it gets a little bit confusing, there are a few cases where there's good evidence, to a degree there's evidence that on occasion government agencies may have sort of mimicked the men in black. In other words, if they wanted to silence someone, they might actually have dressed in the black suit and the black fedora as a means to sort of get the message across, but also to cover their own tracks. In other words, they may have said to themselves, look, we don't know who these real men in black are, but we know that they terrify people, so maybe we should occasionally dress like that. If we want to silence someone, it'll act as a good cover. So in other words, we have the real men in black, and possibly we have somebody else masquerading to cover their tracks. So it does get confusing when we're looking into the government angle, but for the most part, I think we can kind of rule that out. And the next one. Now, one of the more intriguing theories is, could the men in black be time travelers? That's a guy named Josh Warren, a friend of mine, and Josh wonders if they could be sort of like paranormal police officers almost. In other words, they crop up and pop up at certain key times and events and try and mend and fix timelines, or to prevent timelines from being broken, and that they could be from the future. Now, that's an interesting theory because a lot of the issues and the angles that people talk about, particularly the witnesses when it comes to the men in black, does suggest they're kind of out of time. Even today in the 21st century, they still dress like they did back in the 40s and 50s. That's to say, with the old style fedoras, black suits, a skinny black tie. They kind of look like they sort of stepped out of like a 1950s gangster movie or something like that. And that's still how they dress and look today. So in other words, their clothing is totally out of time. They don't seem very sort of conversant with our mannerisms and the way we talk, and they seem totally non-understanding of our society, as if they've been literally just thrown into it. And they often are seen driving old-style Cadillac cars, black Cadillacs, which again seem totally out of time. So Josh has sort of wondered, could they actually be from the future, and that whereas we see them as the bad guys, that maybe they're sort of like a future police force that comes back, as I said, to try and fix timelines and prevent us from getting too close to issues that they think are dangerous, like UFOs or the paranormal. One of the things that crops up in relation to this in many reports is that when people are visited by the men in black, before they begin their threat, they ask the witness, what time is it? You know, the person might think, well, it's 2:45 or it's 6:30. But Josh wonders, are they actually saying, what time is it? What time am I in? As if the timeline they're talking about rather than the minute or the hour. And of course the fact that, you know, that their clothing is totally out of time as well. It's sort of static and unchanging. And Josh has sort of pondered on the idea, well, what if in the distant future something's happened to our civilization and they only have vague remnants left of the 20th century or the 21st? And what if some of those remnants are photographs of people from the 50s wearing the clothes of the 1950s. So he sort of pondered on the idea that if that's the case, they use the small amount of data available to come back, and they think they're sort of fitting in, when in reality fitting in is actually the last thing they're doing. You know, they're just standing out completely. So it's an interesting theory, but of course it's sort of dictated by whether or not time travel is actually possible. But if it is, then, you know, we could make sort of an interesting case that that's exactly what the Men in Black are, time travelers. And the next, please. Probably, well, not probably, definitely the most controversial theory for what the Men in Black might be is that they have literal demonic origins. Now, that's a guy named Ray Boucher. Ray has an interesting background. He's a former state director for MUFON. In the 1980s, he ran the Nebraska office of MUFON, and he still lives in Nebraska to this day. But as well as being a UFO researcher, as you can see, Ray's also a priest, and he got interested in the UFO subject at a young age, and the more he dug into it and the more he entered like the world of religion, he came to believe that the Men in Black are like a demonic manifestation. In other words, sort of like a demonic deception, like a camouflage, if you like, presenting themselves in what looks like a Man in Black form, when from Ray's perspective it's sort of a deceptive demonic entity. Now, what's interesting is that for many years a covert group within the US government did actually pursue the entire angle of whether or not there could be sort of a demonic aspect to the UFO subject. And the group was sort of like a think tank organisation that was funded quite extensively to not just look into the subject of ufology, but also study ancient books on demonology and the occult. And they drew a lot of parallels between today's UFO encounters and so-called demonic encounters in the past. So, you know, it's an interesting theory. It's for many people, it's sort of a very creepy and disturbing theory. And of course, it's dependent very much on, you know, what your thoughts, personal thoughts are on the idea that demons exist or don't exist. But certainly for Ray, you know, that's what he believes they are. And certainly for this think tank group in the government, they entered the subject looking at it from a purely nuts and bolts alien angle, and then came away feeling that what they were dealing with was something extremely dangerous and supernatural. But again, this sort of demonstrates, because we don't have all the answers to what the subject is, it inevitably sort of provokes belief systems in varying degrees and ways. And the next one, please. Probably the next strangest aspect of all this that is really sort of out of the ordinary is that many people who've been using Ouija boards have been visited by the Men in Black. Now, what's particularly strange about these cases is that the encounters don't occur with somebody knocking on the front door. Typically what happens is that I've got somewhere in the region about 15 of these reports. Tim Beckley's got, I know, at least 7 or 8 where people have been using Ouija boards, and then either that same night after they've gone to bed, or perhaps a night after that, or the one after that, they were woken up in the middle of the night, sort of semi-paralysed in bed, unable to move. And it's always during one particular time period. It's never sort of midnight or 1:30. It's always between sort of 2:30 and 3:30, sort of when you're in a really deep sleep, you know, in the dead of night. And people wake up feeling paralysed or semi-paralysed, and they see this sort of silhouetted shadow person, as they're known, looming over the bed. And the person almost always gets a feeling that whatever this thing is, it's extremely dangerous and evil. But what's intriguing about the cases with the Ouija boards is that they see this shadowy figure wearing what looks like a black fedora. So in other words, they look very much like the old style Men in Black. And again, it kind of suggests that the act of sort of using the Ouija board opens a portal that allows these things to come through in some sort of supernatural fashion, which is pretty much what Albert Bender did back in the 40s with his so-called supernatural altar in his attic. So again, as I said at the beginning, this takes us down some really strange and alternative pathways. And the next one, please. Now, we also have, as strange as it sounds, vampire parallels between the Men in Black mystery and vampires. Now, when you talk about the Men in Black and then visiting people and threatening people, most people, I would imagine, assume that the Men in Black sort of kick the front door down and slam people against the wall and tell them, you know, you won't talk about this, you won't talk about what you've seen. That's actually not what happens. It's actually completely different. Most of the cases of Men in Black encounters occur late at night and after the sun's gone down. So that's sort of the first parallel between the old vampires of folklore and legend. You know, they don't come out in the day, they only come out at night. And the most interesting one from my perspective is that when the Men in Black knock on the front door and the person opens the door, now that's an important thing to note as well, is that I'm sure most of us in the room tonight, if you know you went home, you're sitting watching TV at midnight and you suddenly hear this slow bang on the front door, and that's how the Men in Black do it. You know, they don't sort of go like that, it's sort of like that. And literally, that's what most of the witnesses say. And again, I think it's kind of done to scare the life out of the person, which, you know, some people it might do. If you're sitting there watching TV at midnight and you hear those sort of 3 slow bangs on the door. But most of us, if not all of us, you know, you wouldn't open the door to them. I mean, the very least, you're going to look through the spy hole and you see 3 Men in Black stood there. You're either going to call the police or you're going to open the door and pull your gun out or whatever, you know. But people don't. What actually happens is people do let them in. It's like their mind's being controlled, like their common sense factors go out of the window. So you have the mind control aspect, which also turns up in vampire legends. But the most significant one is that all the witnesses have said that, you know, with hindsight, they would never have let them in. But everybody does let them in, and they invite them in. They tell them, you can come in. And that ties in with the old vampire stories, that the first time a vampire enters your home, it has to be invited in. And that's what we get with the Men in Black. They won't enter a person's home. You know, if you just go like that, they won't come in. You have to say, please come in, or will you come in? And the witnesses feel mind controlled into saying those words, and then they kind of come in with this weird sort of shuffling movement that's sort of typical of them. And then they sit down, and the witnesses of them report sometimes that as one of the Men in Black is sort of grilling them and threatening them, the other 2 are usually just staring at them with really sort of malevolent staring eyes. And when that happens, a lot of the witnesses start to feel ill, kind of like Albert Bender did, where they feel lightheaded, dizzy, clammy. One person I spoke to said they felt it was the closest thing they could imagine to some, like a diabetic who sort of misses breakfast, misses lunch, and then by 9 o'clock at night they're in sort of crash mode, you know, where the blood sugar drops and they feel cold and clammy and sick. And that's how the witness described it, that she felt as if she was going to pass out, she had the shakes. And this has given rise to the idea that, again with the vampire parallels, that they're almost like psychic vampires, not like the vampires of folklore and mythology that drink blood, but the idea that they drain our life force, they drain our energy. In other words, they're like a paranormal parasite that feeds on us. In the way that we feed on food, they feed on human energy. And that's one of the more disturbing theories, the idea that they deliberately target people and enter the home, essentially because they need to feed. And in essence, we're their fuel. And so when they're threatening us, and we're sat on the couch in this weird, dazed, hypnotized state, they're bleeding us dry of energy. And if that is the case, you know, it might explain why the whole goal of their visit is to terrify people. You terrify a person, you have all these stress chemicals running around your body, energy's flowing, and then maybe that's the whole point. They then feed on that high state of energy that they've actually created in you by terrifying you. So, you know, the vampire aspects to this are very intriguing, and I'm not talking, of course, about real vampires, but I do sometimes wonder if the old legends of vampires could actually have been based on centuries-old visits from the Men in Black. And there is some evidence for that. For example, Brad Steiger, who we mentioned earlier, Brad found that a number of people who back in the 1500s who were dabbling into the world of alchemy. Alchemy is this sort of magical method allegedly by which metals like tin and lead can be turned into silver and gold. And Brad found that a lot of alchemists in the 1500s and the 1600s were visited late at night by men in black cloaks, and they would arrive either on a black horse or they would arrive in a black carriage pulled by black horses. So it kind of sounds like these are sort of 400-500-year-old equivalents of today's Men in Black, who instead of turning up with a black carriage and a black horse and a black cloak, they wear a black suit and turn up in a black Cadillac. So it could be sort of a modern day equivalent of a very ancient phenomenon that sort of gave birth to the vampire mythology. And the next one. Now, you might wonder why I'm sitting next to a gravestone, and I'll explain. It's kind of a winding story, so just bear with me. Every year my dad comes over for a vacation, and it's always sort of a task sometimes to try and find new places to take him to he hasn't been. And this picture was taken 2 years ago, and I said to him, well, you know, one of the places I knew he hadn't been to, I said, I'll take you to the graves of the famous gangsters Bonnie and Clyde. So I live in Dallas, and Bonnie and Clyde's graves, the gangsters, they're both in Dallas. And so on the morning I had to do some work on an article on the Men in Black, which is an important thing to remember. And so I said to my dad, we'd go out in the afternoon, I'd show him Bonnie and Clyde's graves. And that's Clyde's grave, and as you can see there's all flowers and people put drinks around it and all sorts of things, sort of paying homage to this violent gangster. And but the important thing that I'm coming to is the issue of the title MIB and Synchronicities. Now, Synchronicities, for those who may not know, it's basically a coincidence that seems beyond a coincidence, where something so strange happens that you could not imagine it happening. You know, kind of like if you leave here tonight and you think of your best friend when you were 5 years old at school and they've moved thousands of miles away, and then you happen to run into them 2 hours after you thought about them for the first time in 10 years. That's kind of a synchronicity, where it's like a meaningful coincidence that almost as if it was orchestrated. Well, as I said, I wrote this article, or part of it, on the morning, on the Men in Black. We went out to see the grave. Now, right next to Clyde's grave is his brother's grave, whose name is, let me get it right, Marvin Ivan Barrow. You can have the next one. And that's his gravestone, MIB. And as you can see, it's even got like the period after the M, the I and the B. And people said, you know, a few people said, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. But things like that, when it comes to the Men in Black, happen to me all the time, to where I don't think it's a coincidence. I think something weirder is going on, and it comes down to this thing of when you go looking for the Men in Black, they sort of have this trickster kind of approach. And that gravestone is probably about this wide and about this high. I kind of thought it would look good on my wall back at home, but I didn't really want to get arrested for grave robbing, so I left it where it was. But again, that kind of thing, weird synchronicities in relation to the Men in Black, happen all the time. I have no way to explain how or why synchronicities happen, but they do. And the more that you get into these kind of subjects, the more and more synchronicities people have. And the next one. Now, I mentioned earlier about the women in black. I was actually talking with Steve about this on the journey up, and he said, you know, how did you come to write a book about a subject that really most people in the subject don't know about? And I probably wouldn't, or I know for sure I wouldn't have been able to write it had I not written the 3 books on the Men in Black. But having written those 3 books, you know, I get a lot of feedback from people who've had their own MIB encounters. You know, someone will say, hey, I've read your book, I just wanted to share this event with you. And probably out of every 15 to 20 reports I get of the Men in Black, somebody will say, well, I had a Man in Black type report, but it wasn't a man, it was a woman, or it was a man and a woman. And I got a few of these reports round about 2010, 2011, And I wrote a few articles about it, and that brought more and more reports in, and to the point where that book, which came out just a few months ago, I think I've got somewhere about 80 or 90 cases in the book with only one person who didn't want to speak on the record. You know, so that's an important thing, that everybody was quite happy to speak out. But again, it sort of demonstrates that even this far down the field in ufology, that we can actually find a new aspect of the phenomenon that did not exist or wasn't known of before. And so, in other words, we're dealing with a phenomenon that is sort of like an offshoot or a parallel to the Men in Black mystery. Now, the women in black are kind of just like the men in black. They're very pale looking, black hair, they dress in black, sort of black business suit, and they turn up at people's doorsteps, and they have this sort of hypnotic kind of control over the witness or the person they're threatening. And there's very, very little difference at all. The biggest difference, I guess, is that very often the women in black, they turn up on a person's door. They don't necessarily have to ask to cross the threshold, so to speak. They make claims to, like they're a census taker or something like that. They need to ask questions about how many people live in the home, you know, what the average family income is, because they're doing a survey for the government, and they'll quickly flash an ID card, and the person lets them in, and then the questions start to get weird. Have you had any strange dreams lately? Do you believe in UFOs? And then the person's like, well, let me see that ID card again, you know. And then they make their excuses and leave. But they've sort of sown the seeds of threatening the person, and these people don't forget these events. And I think also tied into the women in black and the men in black issue is that of, again, something else relatively recent you might have heard of, that of the black-eyed children. And the black-eyed children, as the name suggests, are kids they look about 11 or 12 years old, but they have these solid black eyes. I don't just mean the middle part, I mean the entire eye is black. And they very often turn up late at night on people's doorsteps, and they've got, you know, they knock on the door and they say, please can we come in, we're lost, or we're homeless, or can we phone our parents, or can you give us some money? And again, they try and find a way into the house, but they don't force their way in. They say, please can we come in and use the phone? So they wait for the person to let them in. And of course, most people, when they see the face and they see the eyes, they don't let them in. And there have been a number of interesting cases where when the doorbell's rung late at night and the dogs run to the front door, and as the owner has, you know, just pulled the dog back and opened the door, the dogs have just essentially howled and raced off under the bed. There's actually two famous cases, as if the dogs were able to somehow pick up on some sort of negative energy given off by these black-eyed children. So, in other words, I think all these phenomena, the men in black, the women in black, the shadow people, the black-eyed children, I think all of these are part of one bigger phenomenon. And personally, you know, looking at all the different theories, time travelers, demonic, the government, my personal view is I think there's some sort of supernatural entity that sort of coexists with us, like in multi-dimensions. For example, things like quantum physics today are allowing for the existence of multi-dimensions beyond ours. Probably the easiest way to explain it, you know, if you're in the car listening to the radio and you don't like the song that's playing, you flick to another channel. You don't like that, you flick to another. All these channels are going on at once, but you can only be tuned into one at any given time. And so it's kind of like that with the multi-dimensional theory, that if you know how to jump from our reality to another, you would be in a completely different reality. And so, in other words, that's kind of my theory, at least, the idea that we're dealing with something that flits in and out of our reality, but for reasons we don't understand, has a vested interest in silencing and threatening people in the UFO subject and related phenomena. So I hope that's sort of given you some background on the real men in black, who, as I've shown time and again, are very different to Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And so if anybody's got any questions about the men in black, women in black, or any aspect of ufology, you know, we can get into that now. Thanks a lot.